Gosh, what do you think we should call this episode today?
Well, how about that's not you, that's your ego?
I don't know. How about why you should care if your ego is showing?
How about how to know if your ego is showing?
How about how to catch your ego in the act?
Or my ego is bigger than your ego.
I like let go of my ego.
You mean let go of my ego?
Welcome to the Live True podcast. I'm David Lovelace.
And I'm Caron Lovelace, and this is the podcast dedicated to true spiritual living.
Join us for a candid conversation around personal spiritual secrets that can revolutionize the way that you see yourself, the way you love and relate to others, and enable you to do your work with even more fruitfulness and fulfillment. We're sharing some of our successes and failures, as well as interviews and insights from some of the best spiritual leaders, psychologists, and wisdom teachers. We're here to help fuel your desire to live, love, and lead from the source of your true identity.
Today we'll be talking about our ego from one way or another.
So what are we going to end up calling this?
I'm not sure yet. We're going to get there in a minute. But before we go there, there are some pretty funny things or interesting things that are going on. I don't know if all of them are funny. I do want to catch everybody up with something that happened this last weekend.
What's that?
We were in a meeting on Sunday morning. We have a group in our home on Sunday mornings. And it's been a great eclectic group of people that just show up, and we have a great time for about an hour and a half.
And we have Christ, conversation, and community, right?
All those things together. So this last Sunday morning, David was kind of teaching, and I don't want to say waxing eloquent, but he was teaching some great passages. And we were going around sharing, and David called on this one woman. And before he did that, he kind of set it up like this. He said, so it seems that you've kind of been feeling emotional about some of the things we've been talking about. I've been noticing you're tearing up a little bit about some of this. How is it touching you? And she says, what?
She said, no, I wasn't particularly touched by anything, even though I was, but it's my allergies.
It's my allergies. So she was sitting there with the tissue, like blotting her eyes, and David's thinking, gosh, she's really moved by this amazing teaching. Pretty funny.
Oh, yes.
We all got a good laugh out of that.
Yes. Well, I had forgotten about it till you had to come and go and bring it up now.
So, by the way, while I was getting ready for this podcast, I went in and I sprayed a bunch of cologne on, and I sprayed it right in my eye. So if you see tears coming out of my eyes, it's not because I'm so moved by this podcast. It's just that I sprayed perfume in my eye.
So that begs a bigger question to me. Why did you spray on perfume when it's just the two of us here in this studio recording together?
And if I have to tell you the reason for that, since it's just the two of us in this podcast room.
I do like that. You know what? I knew that all along, and I was going to ask you after the show today, what's that cologne you're wearing?
You ought to know. You bought it for me.
No, that's right. Oh, hey, I get to go to a really cool thing a couple of days from now. I got invited to, again, it's a group called the Dream Builders, and it's a group of leaders that are convened from around the city.
And that's Central Florida?
Yeah, in Central Florida. And just a bunch of guys that, are out in the marketplace, and business guys that are regularly trying to figure out what is the big idea of what they do or they've been called to that has real meaning for them and would add great value to the culture and the world around them. And all they do is basically share what they're dreaming about. And I love they always begin with this Genesis phrase. Everyone has to go around the table and go, let it be. So you say what your dream is, and everyone says, let it be, just like God said, let there be. So
that's awesome.
Yeah, it is really cool.
I wonder what you're going to share. What your big dream is.
My big dream is to finish this honking book we're in the middle of writing now.
This ebook and audio program.
Right, that you keep moving the deadline back
I'm
on.
not doing that.
Okay. All right. Hey, we've heard from a number of folks again this last week concerning the last couple of weeks' podcast. Why don't you tell us about a couple of those?
Yeah, there was a couple from California who said, just listen to your marvelous podcast. How sweet, huh?
Yes.
And what a great job you did. Thanks so much. So many people will be helped in the coming months and years by your podcast and the insights God's giving you both. Your best days are still ahead. And we agree with that, right?
Yep. High five.
High five.
Yep, there you go.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Another person wrote and said, over the last 60 years, I've come to understand that I have a shame-based personality. While informative, understanding is not necessarily restorative.
That's very true.
That's really true. Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's great self-reflection
Yeah.
there. And this person goes on and writes, what Cronin you are sharing gives me hope of restoration like the prodigal found as he returned to his father. The podcast specifically on the arrogance of capacity spoke to me greatly. Just like you, I thought I could handle it all. But I found that a shame-based person attempts to cover their deficits with a desire to achieve perfection, control outcomes, and achieve grandiose visions. When I did achieve, there was another goal that became the target within days. Mm-hmm. When I failed, well, that was only the true me reveal. I am a worn-out pup. But now I'm trying to walk in the Holy Spirit, and not with my flawed thinking patterns that have become such deep ruts within me. And so that's really good stuff right there.
Yeah. That was quite a self-revealing comment, and we really, really appreciate that, Bill.
Yes, that's right. In our last episode, hopefully you heard it, I talked in depth with Francis Anfuso. I interviewed him about how our lives can really be transformed when we stop asking God to change our circumstances and allowing Him to really change our perspective. And so if you missed that podcast on Perfectly Positioned, you can find that interview at the Live True podcast on iTunes or go to the podcast page of our website.
And we just want to mention that this podcast is brought to you by YouLiveTrue.com. That's YOU, livetrue.com, an online site that's dedicated to help you live, love, and lead from the source of your true identity. Find out more at YouLiveTrue.com.
Okay, so why must we know about our ego?
Because it's up to a lot of shenanigans in our lives.
It is.
And good stuff and not so good stuff sometimes.
Yeah.
So before we get to that, though, let's just kind of define what an ego is, because I think sometimes there's a lot of things thrown around and all different kinds of ideas about what it is, what it isn't. So I used to think that when someone's quote unquote ego was showing, that person was pretty much just full of himself, bigger than life, sucking all the air out of a room to keep himself pumped up and sure of himself, or herself, I could say. But I'm discovering that that's just really the tip of the iceberg. That's a kind of caricature, really, version of an ego, because there's so much more to it. So what are some things that you understand about the ego?
So I remember, 15, 20 years ago, Ken Blanchard, the well-known business writer, he was writing a book, not on this particular subject, but on leadership. And he had a whole chapter on the ego. And I don't remember hardly anything about it, except I remember the acrostic he used of EGO, of edging God out. And that's kind of always stuck with me over the years. It's kind of like my ego is whenever I push God out to the fringes in my attitude, my behavior, my reactivity to people, to circumstances, and I immediately usher myself into the center where I make it all about me and my orientation in my life. Actually, the Bible has a heck of a lot to say about our ego. It just uses a number of different words for it. It talks about our flesh. It talks about our old nature. In our vernacular, we would also talk about in terms of our false self or our compulsive identity.
Or our shadow self.
Or our shadow self. Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Yep.
So our ego is there when we think we need someone to go to bat for us. It will always, no matter what it takes, get our own way for us. Except in that rare occasion when you getting your own way makes my life even better for me. Right?
Yeah.
So it's self-centered, it's self-focused, it's self-protective, it's basically selfish, right?
Yeah, it is. It is. It's interesting that we know there is initially starting out in our lives, we construct this, what some teachers refer to as a container, which is our ego, and it contains some part, some expression of ourselves. Where it goes wrong is when we either exaggerate what our ego is doing or something else, which we'll talk more about in just a few moments.
But it's self-aware, it's constant. It really has only one orientation, and that's for the self.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah. I heard recently that 99% of all of our conversation has to do with us, where we are the complete orientation. That's why the most used word in every language is the word I.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah. Here's another thing about the ego. Sometimes our ego can be a real tough taskmaster because it kind of like cracks the whip whenever we're not achieving enough, we're not perfect enough, we're not keeping our life up and to the right, we're not looking good enough. It can be a real taskmaster. Have you experienced that?
Yeah, I have. I definitely feel the ego, especially in the appearance area. Think if I don't look right, I'm not willing to go out.
Yeah.
I'm not ready to go out.
Yeah.
It wants to keep up appearances, whether that's to keep my lawn right now is not looking as well as it should, in my opinion. And so my ego is saying something's wrong with your lawn. That means something's wrong with me, So my ego is reminding me, you need to fix that lawn because that doesn't look good in the neighborhood.
Wait a minute. When we came in last night, I thought you said I needed to do something about it and fix it.
It's my lawn, but you need to fix it. That's right.
Okay, all right. I know for me, my ego's been a tough taskmaster just around achievements. And, my ego would always tell me, okay, David, that's not enough. You need to do something more. You need to achieve more. And again, that's an example of where I thought that was who I was. My identity was tied up around that.
And so when you did achieve more, it was also like, okay, your ego is saying to you, look what you did. You could do that.
That's
so
right.
that means you could probably do something even greater, even bigger, because you were able to do that. It's like, it's always kind of one-upping something in you, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. It is. Yeah, it
but
can
that's
work.
getting ahead too, because there's something else we want to talk about that in a minute.
Both sides of the aisle there. I think we've both seen this a lot over the years with well-meaning parents.
Yeah.
So where their ego is cracking a whip because they feel like their kids haven't achieved enough or their kids aren't perfect enough.
How about the dad in the grandstands yelling at the kid? Like screaming and yelling at the top of his lungs. Usually it's a him, but I have been known to scream myself.
Yeah, let's not be sexist about it.
Well, I mean, usually it is the dad, but oftentimes there'll be a mom involved that's kind of loud, and I have been one of those mothers. But where you just feel like they're just bearing down on the kid, and if the kid does bad, it really, really affects them.
Yeah. I was sitting in such a football game a couple of weeks ago, and there was a dad just screaming at the top of his lungs at his son, like, "What are you thinking? Why did you do that?" And
I bet it wasn't as nice as that.
Yeah. He used some other heavenly language or something.
Yeah, I mean, I remember when our oldest son was playing baseball, and I would get so uptight, or basketball. As all of our boys have played in sports, and whenever one of them was playing, I remember I oftentimes felt worse at their loss than they did. And it would affect me.
Yeah.
And so I think, what do you think that is? That's over-identification with achievement, with an outcome?
Yeah, it seems like the scripture indicates that the reason why Jesus wants us to die to ourself, he's referring to not the real essence of who we are and our uniqueness. He's referring to this ego that is a small self that lives just for itself and measures everything regarding itself And it's what, I think we could call it the kingdom of me, as opposed to living into a bigger self, our God self, into the larger kingdom of God, and where the whole orientation is not around us.
Okay, well, our ego will get aggressive if the situation calls for it. It will all out fight another ego to the death for the shortest checkout line, best parking space, prime seat at the movies, or the jolliest holiday lawn decorations. And our ego will win. You do understand that, don't you? My ego will win, right? So that's about competitiveness and envy and one-upping other people. There's winners and losers in this life. You need to know that, our ego will say. And it's value judging. What do you think about that?
Well, shoot. I hate even thinking about it because, I'm guilty as charged when it comes to that expression of it as well. I don't know why, but it's like, if someone else beats me to the punch, it's almost like my ego says, see, you're not enough. You should have jumped in there quicker. You should have. You could have, And again, that's living in a small world and inside of my small self. And also it's a reflection of the whole not enough. Okay. It just, there's not enough there. You need more. David, you need more. That's the ego just outright lying to me.
There's just so much competitiveness all around us in small and big ways all the time, besides just the obvious things of sports and that nature of things, politics, that nature of things. But there's competitiveness all the time. Like we even see it with little children, like he got a bigger cookie than I did. It starts really young, really, really young.
Our grandkids have done their fair share of that.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, I didn't want that color, right. A popsicle, whatever. Yeah.
Or you're driving down the street and you see a parent is driving their car and they don't have one, my child made the honor roll.
Right.
They've got 8 of those stickers from the last 8 years. And it's like it's an all-out fight of who's got the smartest, brightest, best kid. Because at the end of the day, we think that's a reflection back on us. That is our ego lying to us.
Our great kids are great because of how great we are. Yeah. And I'm definitely, definitely one of those people that I think I've let that happen too much in my own mothering. I actually do. I just took a picture the other day, no lie, I have it on my phone, of somebody who had about 8 or 9 different stickers in a row for their kid on the honor roll on their car, because I was just so like, are you serious? I mean, you've got to show the world that I got a really, really smart kid here. And there's nothing wrong with being proud of our children. Yep. But when we do something that we're going to talk about right now in just a few minutes, there's an exaggeration that we become identified with, that the ego is really, really sticking out. So what's another one?
Well, another one is, in a number of extreme cases, our ego won't let us drive anything but the hottest, baddest car in town. And often it really doesn't even matter what our budget is or what we can afford. It has everything to do with what is going to make us look or feel better. Now, just think about that. If I need to look better in order to feel better, then I am identifying with the false part of me, what is most not true about me.
Something outside, right?
Right.
Something outside of us.
Something outside. So in that, we're actually looking for a bigger authority in a car or in a house, where we end up overly identifying with, I am the car that I drive. I am the house that I live in. I mean, I have to admit, I've wrestled with that over the years myself about the kind of home that I've lived in. And, you and I had, a big challenge a year and a half ago when, we had to leave the home of our dreams and we had to move into something, much smaller. And, it was still nice and we're grateful for it. But it was a very big difference from what we had been living in and what we felt like we needed at that time.
Yeah, I definitely have over-identified with my home. I have just part of that is I love decorating. I love designing. And in that home particular, I literally oversaw every single detail of the remodel of that house. And so it was my blood, sweat, and tears that put that home together. But I over-identified with it. And my ego was very involved with it. And we can easily do that with anything we have that's a possession, that's something that's outside of ourselves. We can easily take that on as kind of like appendage of who we are, right? Even our career,
exactly.
for instance.
Right? Our career, we can overly identify with that. Nothing wrong with having a great career or desiring to have that. But am I doing that so it can act as the fullest expression of who God made me to be? Or do I need that particular career move to work out so I'll feel better about me that I don't feel good enough about? So
how about this? I see this all the time with parents with college kids. Kids are going off to school or choosing colleges or not. And you see the parent struggling with a college choice that a child may or may not make. That would be a reflection on them as well.
Yeah. It's endless, isn't it? Mm-hmm. Does that have anything to do with why I'd like to buy me a used Jeep?
Yeah. I think you have this idea, your ego has this idea anyway, that you would be a wild and free guy in the mountains, even though we live at the sea level in Florida. You somehow have this idea that we need a Jeep to get through the sand. Maybe that's what it is.
I guess so. Talk to us about another part of
this.
this.
Our ego often begs to differ or declines when someone gives us a genuine compliment. It keeps us in our place. It thinks a little humiliation is good for the soul. So there's this diminishment versus exaggeration that the ego will play with us and try to convince us that we either need to really diminish ourselves or exaggerate who we are. It doesn't know anything about the whole middle ground that is peace and contentment. It has to either really diminish ourselves or really exaggerate who we are.
Yeah, when I hear those words, I think about some of the synonyms of both of those around. My ego is either going to try to make me feel superior. Superior.
Okay, that's a new word.
Make me feel more superior or make me feel inferior.
Right.
And so it's both of those things. Whenever we are experiencing either side of that, then there's our ego that's trying to inform us of who we are, when in fact that is an outright lie. Yeah. So
that's a huge thing. The diminishment, exaggeration is always something to be looking for. Is that how we're going to know the ego is actually in play at the moment? He's going to be an exaggeration or diminishment of something.
Yes, yeah.
External.
In fact, a wise sage who lived a couple of 100 years ago said this one time, or wrote this down. He said in one of his books, he said, all sin is either an exaggeration or a diminishment of what is actually true. What's actually true about us, what's actually true about God, what's actually true about other people. So whenever we stretch that in either direction, then that is a whole different way of looking at missing the mark.
I see. Okay. Yep. Missing the true mark of who we truly are.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So another one has to do with just how our ego has this very sneaky way of blindfolding us to our blind spots, just so we will have self-protection going on. At times it nearly falls over itself to keep us and all those other people hidden from our less desirable qualities that are actually, if truth be told, are wreaking havoc in some of our closest relationships. Except we can't be shown our own wretchedness because that would be far too disturbing for us to bear. So, you've been down that alley before?
Yeah.
Blindfolded, led down that aisle?
Blindfolded to my blind spots.
Yeah.
There's a self-deception that is self-protective. For some reason, we don't want to see the uglier sides of ourselves, and so our ego will help us kind of camouflage that or mask that so that we don't look so bad to other people when we really do have faults and we have weaknesses and we have humanity living inside of us.
Yeah.
And our ego wants to cover that and make us seem more perfect or more whole or more put together or more okay. And we really truly are okay, but that there's a doubt in us that we are okay. And so that doubt in us needs to always be covered and protected from anybody really getting, any kind of inside scoop on who we really are.
Yeah. I think another way we've both seen this play out is when we project onto others what turns out to be who we really are.
That is a weird thing. I mean, I have to admit,
yeah.
I see it all the time, but at the same time, I have to say that's one of the stranger things that I think happens in us psychologically is this projection.
Yeah, exactly. So it works like this. The very things I refuse to see in me, I will tend to identify in you and call them out in you because I can't see them in myself.
That's just weird.
Yeah.
But it's so absolutely true.
It is absolutely true.
And I think it would be a great exercise for us to just constantly be saying to ourselves, what is it that I keep pointing out in other people?
Yes.
What is it, that thing that I keep seeing? And just going, okay, for the time being, let's just write it down maybe even, or make a note of at least one thing that I keep seeing in somebody else that really irritates me.
Yeah.
I mean, really, really upsets me.
For example, if you're constantly seeing other people that are very critical, is that perhaps something that is a blind spot in you, right?
Yes, that's right.
What would be another example of that?
Possibly someone who might say, I think that person is very judgmental, or that person is actually rude. That person is rude.
Yeah.
And I don't like rude people.
Yeah.
When actually there is some root of rudeness in the person saying that.
Exactly. And that's probably has a lot to do with the reason why Jesus was so big on not judging others. Think of all the times in the Gospels and later on the epistles, the whole thing of judgment is a light is shown on it. So when Jesus says, if you see a splinter in your brother's eye, what you need to be paying attention to is not that splinter, but it's reflecting a log in your own eye. Mm-hmm. Now that is one powerful statement right there. So to me, Jesus is trying to teach us right there that other people, what we react to in them is actually acting as a mirror for us. Mm-hmm. But we need to just pause there real quickly because, again, I can hear another part of my ego trying to jump in there and bring judgment and condemnation to me, when in fact Jesus isn't trying to do that. Jesus is just, out of his love for me, he wants to say, David, do you know why you see this in these other people? This is a part of what you have always wrestled with yourself. I'm your dad. I'm your loving dad. I want you to see that because it is, to the point we were making a moment ago, it's sabotaging. It's creating train wrecks for you all the time. And you are the only one that can't see it.
Yeah, that's what the blind spot does from the ego.
Now, sometimes you and I, when we're walking around that house interacting over stuff, every once in a while, we've been known to say to each other, now wait just a minute, what you just said about what I was thinking or feeling, were you actually projecting yourself on me?
Yeah. We do call each other out sometimes.
Yeah. So would we recommend that for everyone?
Well, you could try it. You kind of have to have a willing partner, though. Somebody who's willing to go, okay, you probably are right.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
But so it doesn't always work.
And we react like that at least 50% of the time.
Oh, well, maybe half the time, if we're lucky.
Yeah, maybe half the time. What's another one?
Well, not only does our ego keep our dark side camouflaged from us, it never fails to keep us polished and shining, like the ideal woman or man, wife or husband, mother mother, father, daughter, son, or friend that we think we are 24/7. Our ego will go to very impressive lengths to protect our reputation should someone, Lord help them, who doesn't know what's good for them, decides to question even the tiniest aspect of our personhood. So our ego really does want us to have an ideal image. We idealize ourselves, the situation we're in, and it's really there to kind of keep that self-image shiny in front of other people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I'm thinking about my idealization. My idealization is that I'm successful. Mm-hmm. So that's my idealized self. Mm-hmm. I'm constantly trying to, over the years, mm-hmm. I've tried to put out there to other people. Mm-hmm. And when in fact I have been, there was success in my life, but I tended to over-identify with it. Again, there's that exaggeration mm-hmm. that my ego would create. And my idealized self was, David is a successful person. Mm-hmm. That's why I could never handle any type of failure whatsoever.
Right.
What's been your idealization?
One of mine is that I'm special. That I am a special person.
Well,
now,
you are special.
I am special, and
mm-hmm.
so are you, though.
Mm-hmm. Ooh, that's
and
right.
So is everyone listening.
Mm-hmm.
Everyone's special.
Yep.
But something about my ego likes to keep me reminded that, oh, you need to be special. You've had a special background, not necessarily positive.
Yeah.
Special could be negative, like
yep.
you've had a, exaggeratedly negative childhood, or
mm-hmm.
some issues or things that have happened to you that maybe haven't happened to other people. So you put yourself in a special victim category. So lots of specialness around the ego. I either have to protect that self-image, or I'm idealizing myself in this shiny, polished way that I want everyone else to see me. We sometimes see our children that way too. I know we have done that with our boys because they were so amazing. So incredible.
3 angelic creatures.
Well, I wouldn't call them angels, but I would call them amazing, incredible people.
Yes.
And they truly are.
Yes.
But there are plenty of times where I know as a mother, mm-hmm. I idealized them and believed that they could, in some ways, I know I was, in reality, I didn't always think that they couldn't do any wrong, because I certainly saw that. But I have this bigger view of them, which really is an interesting dichotomy, because really they are amazing, complete amazing people in their true selves. And I think, to be honest, I think mothers actually get to see that about their kids even better sometimes than anyone else in the world. But sometimes, even as moms, I think we can over-idealize our kids and make them out in our minds to be these super amazing kids. And so when they do fail or we do mess up, it completely crushes us. Like we can't have a concept that they could possibly do, something wrong. And so sometimes that's really not helpful to us. And we need to get a better balance, a more accurate view, who they truly are in their true self. They're absolutely wonderful.
Yeah.
Made in the image of God.
Yep.
But they're still very human, and we need to keep allowing for that.
Yeah, that's good. I think if we were to perhaps try to summarize the whole conversation about the ego and what it is and how we can be aware of it every day, probably we could just put it around calling it the defensive player of the year. Mm-hmm. Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah.
And because anytime I feel defensive, mm-hmm. anytime I feel I have to defend myself, my tribe, my group, mm-hmm. even God.
Even God. Mm-hmm.
As if God needs to be protected and defended, right? And whenever that's happening, more often than not, again, that is the ego right there trying to tell other people and trying to excuse to other people, again, what we refuse to see about ourselves. In fact, the example that comes to my mind right now is, the ego is fully in play with Adam and Eve. Mm-hmm. When God comes to them after they initially disobeyed, And, he asked them what happened. And immediately Eve blames, do you remember? Eve blames Adam, and then Adam blames the serpent.
Yeah.
And they're just passing blame around, unwilling to take full responsibility for what they needed to own just about themselves. Whenever that happens, that's our ego that's trying to take the blame off us and find someone else more suitable to give it to. That's the defensive player of the year.
Yeah, and I think it's probably because I have been defensive on more than one occasion. I know for me, the defensiveness feels like it's coming out of a fragile ego. It seems like the more defensive we are, the more fragile I think our egos actually truly are. And we're coming from a different, not necessarily that over exaggeration, but maybe more the diminished side of the ego. And that I think that's what I've been aware of. And I also think that there's defensiveness and then there's offensiveness. Like we could be easily offended. Like our ego is easily offended, isn't it?
Yep. You're right. And when it is, that's when that defensive player of the year kicks in.
Well, even you could be offended about something that you don't feel defended about. In other words, I'm offended by that statement, or I'm offended by the way that person treated that other person.
Yeah, but whenever you do that, don't you either overtly, externally defend it, or internally you try to defend it there?
Yeah. It's also a judgment, though. Don't you think you're making a judgment on other people?
Yeah.
Like I'm offended by, something that somebody might have done or said.
Hang on a minute. Just a moment ago, let's back up. Was it your ego that refused to give me complete acknowledgement and credit for a brilliant statement I made?
Which statement was that? You've made so many brilliant statements over my entire lifetime. I can't imagine which one you're talking about.
Right.
But I do think, honestly, offensiveness, we take offense for other people.
Yeah.
And that's our ego too, doing a strange little thing, because it wasn't actually us that somebody was saying something about or doing something to, but we take the offense for the other person, which we were never, ever invited to do or asked to do.
Exactly.
So our ego somehow is involved there too.
Yeah. So let's start wrapping this up.
All right. So I don't know about your ego situation, but I could go on all day about my ego. It's so righteous and special and smart. And okay, it's a touch smart alecky. But just the other day I was shopping and it nudged me to buy the best ever bumper sticker.
What was that?
My church is better than your church.
Seriously, you found that bumper sticker?
I've seen it. Totally just kidding. But oh, wait. Like, do churches also have egos?
Oh, baby, that's another subject for another day. Yes.
Well,
they do.
They do? How?
Yes.
How do they have ego?
Yeah. Churches have egos, every organization, but since you want to pick on churches for just a moment, churches have egos in that they tend to overly identify with a persona that they've tried to project out to its community, to its congregants, to its culture.
Well, where does that come from?
Things like that. When a church doesn't feel secure in who she really is.
And is that?
And when the church feels like it needs to prove something, it needs to be performing even more. And if it were to do that, then it would look better. And I mean, there's even this sense of God would be even more pleased with us.
Yeah. So is that driven by the leaders' egos? Do you think? I'm not saying just one leader, because many churches are led by multiple leaders.
Clearly, if a church is full of people, like 500 people or 5,000 people, it's filled with 500 or 5,000 egos.
So we need to keep our egos surrendered.
Yeah.
But God doesn't have an ego, does he?
Ooh, now see, that's a very profound question.
Because God accomplishes things.
Yep.
He gets things done.
Yeah. Well, when I think about that, I don't think about God having an ego, or else he would react really differently when we are completely indifferent to him, or think about all the false and wrong things that we've thought about God before, we even think about God now, or that we say about God. And it's like God has every reason to keep standing up and going, what are you thinking? And then being very defensive about himself. And we just don't see that happen. As in fact, the opposite of that is true, where God is overly patient, filled with loving kindness. His mercies are new every morning. And those mercies have to do with all of the judgments that we've made on him and on other people.
So he doesn't actually care what he's called, like there's no title that he absolutely must have. Like an ego needs a title, right?
Yeah.
An ego must have a title.
Yeah, it must have a proper name.
And a proper title.
Yep.
Like I need to be the boss of, or the, executive vice president of this, or whatever, right? Yep. Titles are important to egos, but God doesn't really care.
He doesn't. That's why
he's got lots of names. Actually,
exactly. That can be quite upsetting to some people. It's like, hey, couldn't you just give yourself one name?
Yeah.
In the Bible, there are hundreds of names of God, and God goes, "Yeah, that's true. Yeah, that's true. Yeah, that's true.
That all applies to me."
But he doesn't seem to come in and make a case for, here are all the things you don't get, about me. So anyway.
So what do we do with all of this that we've been discussing? What do you think we should do as far as how to actually be on the lookout for our egos rising up and kind of taking control of our lives instead of our true self actually being in the driver's seat with the Spirit of God leading?
Yeah, that's good. Well, I think for me, the prime time takeaway and application from today's podcast is to learn to live in awareness every day. From the time, I get up in the morning, I'm interacting with the family, or I'm going to work, or I'm in the middle of Little League games, or I'm in the middle of playing something competitive, or I'm at the gym, or I'm driving to meet clients, to live with an awareness of when do I feel like I'm not enough or I'm a really, really big deal. And to live in awareness where my mind, my ego is trying to create an exaggeration of what's true or diminishment of what's true. To learn to live in awareness of when do I feel superior, when do I feel inferior, and what is it about in between those two poles where I can just see what God kept repeating over and over and over again in Genesis 1, I believe, as a pattern. This is good. This is good. This is good. You are good. It's fascinating to me. He doesn't say, and it's perfect.
Never perfect.
He just always said, it is good. And that is good enough, seems to be good enough for him. So what does it mean for me to live in that awareness each day that actually I'm good enough? And whatever I do, whatever I wear, whatever I purchase, whatever I try to achieve, can I do that from the place of being someone that's already lavishly loved by God and has been gifted to represent God in some way in my particular role as a parent or as a spouse or as an employee or as an employer, whatever that might be, as opposed to I'm needing to do that to somehow improve how I feel about me, to live in the awareness. That is my ego. And instead of having condemnation, then just going, oh, I see what that is. I don't need to do that.
That's an important aspect, that we don't condemn ourselves when we do see that we have missed the true nature of what God has put into us and made us to be.
Yeah.
I think it's really, really key. That was something that affected you quite a lot when you recognized that you had failed in some way or another. It really did bother you, like somehow that just should not be happening. There shouldn't be humanity in your body.
That's true.
I've actually always felt like I made mistakes, and I didn't, I knew that. So that particular part of the ego has not been a problem for me. But I know for the way you're wired, that whole thing of recognizing when things haven't quite looked the way you wanted them to, or you failed in some way.
Are you projecting on me?
No, I think you've admitted this. You've told me this. So.
I have completely,
and you've told all of us that.
Yes,
so.
yeah, and you're spot on, and that goes back to what I was mentioning a while ago about my idealized self. And that's why failure of any type was just, anytime I made a mistake of any type, I would beat myself to a pulp.
But God doesn't do that.
But He doesn't do that.
God,
That's a great
no matter
point.
what kind of failure, no matter what has happened with us, though we as humans don't handle failure as well in ourselves or with other people, God has no problem with it. Because He expects it. He expects it. And so today,
He's made allowances for it.
Today we want you to be able to walk away from this podcast knowing how irrevocably loved you are, how absolutely good you are, and how God has created you and made you in His image, which is delightful and whole. And there is a place of wholeness that has great love and great value that resides in you. And we just encourage you and pray and ask that God would make you greater and grander in your true self, and that false self, shadow self, ego self would decrease, and that He would increase in you.
That's good. Well, just a couple of quick reminders today. If you want to comment on today's episode, just go to youlivetrue.com, click on the podcast page, and there you'll find a summary of this episode number 6. You can scroll down to the comment section. You can leave your comments right there. Also, we're pretty suspicious. It'd be really helpful if you went ahead and subscribed to this podcast if you haven't already, because that way it'll just show up automatically each week for you in all your digital devices, and you don't have to download it. It's always right there at your handy. Also, we'd be grateful if you'd recommend this podcast to family and friends. If you're listening on your phone, you can just go to those 3 dots next to the title of the podcast that acts as a menu. Click that on, and then just hit the share button. It says share right there. If you're on your computer, there's a share button at the bottom of this particular episode.
And also, if we could help you further, you or your team, we're available for coaching, consulting, or speaking at your next event. You can contact us through our website, youlivetrue.com.
And our podcast next week will be, well, it's a surprise.
It's a surprise podcast?
It's a surprise.
It's a grab bag?
Yes, it is.
Awesome. I can't wait.
It should be good. Okay. Well, that's it for this episode of the Live True podcast.
Until next time, we want to encourage you to always live, love, and lead from the source of your true identity.